Hey, welcome back to the Fight Death podcast. I'm your host, John. In this episode, we're going to continue our discussion of rape and abortion by talking about why exceptions for rape are not logically consistent with the pro-life position. Let's go. In the last episode, we talked about the data surrounding rape and abortion. And we determined that about 1% of abortions are the result of rape. And that's total abortions in the United States. We're limiting our pool of data here. But we also saw that a large proportion of rapes that result in pregnancy also result in abortion. That number was between 31 and 50%. However, that number is not so far off from the total 42% of women with an unplanned pregnancy that choose abortion. So there's not a huge disparity between women who end up with an unplanned pregnancy for some other totally consensual reason and women who end up with an unplanned pregnancy for because they were raped. The reason that it's important to work out those details is because it's going to inform our response going forward, depending on who we're talking to. Primarily, when we run into pro-aborts who bring up rape and say, well, what about rape? The fact that there's only 1% of abortion is the result of rape is very important because it puts us, in terms of abortions taking place in the United States, it puts us in the margins. It puts us on the edge. Today, I want to talk about go through a few thought experiments and talk about why rape is not an exception to the pro-life position. At least rape is not a logically consistent exception to the pro-life position. So the basic argument for a rape exception is this. A woman who has been raped has been violated. And if we as a society require her to carry that rapist baby to term, then we are subjecting her to further violation, or we're extending that violation. Because the woman is going to have to go through a pregnancy, which she did not consent to, and she's going to have to be responsible for the child of the man who raped her. Now, I do want to point out that this argument subtly assumes that there's a morally significant difference between a child before it's born and a child after it's born. And I've talked to pro-aborts. In fact, I'm having a conversation on Instagram, in my Instagram direct messages with somebody right now who says, well, look, even if that child at 8 months is totally conscious and is literally could be born today and be a viable, healthy baby, if the woman who has been raped decides that she doesn't want to have that child, she has the right to go have that child destroyed. So this argument doesn't necessarily have to assume that there's a difference between the preborn and the born child, but often it does. And we already know that this is false. If you go back and listen to episode 1, the SLED framework gives us the 4 different categories into which every difference between a preborn and a born child fall. So we can see, though, that rape doesn't justify abortion if we trot out the toddler, right? And that's that technique that we talked about in episode 2. And we can do that with a couple of thought experiments. So if we imagine there's a woman, and we'll call her Alice. She's trying to become pregnant with her husband. And then one night, she is out at a bar, hanging out with some girls, and as happens, unfortunately, she is drugged and raped. Now, a couple of weeks later, she discovers that she is pregnant, but Alice doesn't know whose the baby is. So she decides to keep the baby because it might be her and her husband's baby, or it might not be. Now, when that baby is born, Alice discovers that her husband is not the father. In this case, would that be a justification to euthanize that infant? Of course, everybody says no, right? Now let's push this a little bit farther. Let's say that the rapist is caught and he's arrested, he's charged, and there's no question. He totally confesses. They actually have it on video. It just took him a while to find him. He doesn't dispute a single fact. He's absolutely guilty, and he admits it. He is actually also a perfect paternal DNA match for the child, for Alice's child. Now, in that time since he raped Alice, he was dating another woman. Let's call her Beatrice, and he had a child with Beatrice. Would the fact that Beatrice's child is the offspring of a rapist, would that be a justification to euthanize that little boy? Of course not, right? So let's keep going. Alice's daughter was born, and let's change it a little bit and say the rapist was never caught. The rapist was never caught. Let's go back in time. Alice's daughter is born. The rapist is never caught. We still don't know whose child Alice's daughter is, the rapist's or Alice's husband. Now, a couple of years later, as Alice's daughter turns 2, Alice looks at her daughter and says, she's really starting to look like the guy who raped me. She doesn't look like my husband at all. She looks like that guy. And now every time Alice looks at her daughter, all she can feel is the trauma of that assault. Would that be a justification for us to euthanize Alice's daughter? And of course, everybody says no. So these 3 scenarios all work together to illustrate why a rape exception is not logically consistent with the pro-life position, right? We don't kill children because their father is a rapist. In fact, in the United States, we are not even allowed to give rapists the death penalty. We don't kill children because they were conceived in rape, and we don't kill children because their mothers suddenly find them repulsive. You can imagine a scenario even where there's no rape, where let's say a third woman, Christina, and her husband, they have a child, and then Christina's husband just becomes a disgusting person, and there's a divorce, and that child, that little boy that Christina and her now ex-husband had, that little boy starts to look like her ex-husband, and all she feels when she looks at that little boy is the trauma of the divorce and the pain and the suffering associated with that. And we can ratchet up the pathos here and say that Christina was the subject of the victim of domestic violence, but not rape, but domestic violence. That Christina's ex-husband, he was perhaps a child predator, and so she left him, but the little boy starts to look like him. Would that be a reason for us to euthanize Christina's little boy? Of course not. So we all inherently recognize the great injustice of rape. What our job as pro-lifers is, we have to persuade people to also recognize that abortion doesn't solve the injustice of rape, but it compounds it. It multiplies one injustice on top of the other. Abortion asks the child to die for the sins of her father. And it violates that child's body in a violent and a more permanent way than the rapist violated the mother's body. And so while the woman can heal and conquer the trauma of rape, the child can never obviously recover from an abortion. An abortion doesn't fix the trauma of rape for the woman. Rape is an act of violence and power that dehumanizes its victims, and it shouldn't be tolerated in our society. But the horror of rape is not undone by abortion. And so there are a number of studies that have shown that abortion increases the grief and trauma associated with rape. So women who are raped who choose abortion often find themselves struggling with this down the line because they feel like they've compounded that. They come to regret the abortion because they feel like it compounded the trauma, that it destroyed the only potential good to come out of that evil. Abortion further wounds one victim while it kills another. So of the two victims of rape, and that's a big part of our job as pro-lifers, is to point out that the child is just as much a victim of his or her father's sin as the mother is. And of those two victims, now we have a dead victim and a potentially further wounded victim. So to kind of recap and wrap up, we don't make an exception for rape in the pro-life position because the child in utero is morally no different from the child once it's born. There's no ethical difference that would justify killing that child in one situation that wouldn't also justify killing that child in another, that is before and after birth. So we don't kill children who are born because they were conceived in rape. We don't kill children who are born because their father is a rapist. And we don't kill children who are born because they repulse their mothers. None of these reasons work to eliminate a child outside of the womb, and so none of these reasons can work to eliminate a child inside the womb. In the next episode, I'm going to talk a bit about how to answer this question directly. Not just some thought experiments that you can run through, but an on-the-ground strategy for discussing this when you're in the middle of a conversation with a pro-abort person. Thank you so much for listening to the Fight Death Podcast. If you want more content, you can check out fightdeathpodcast.com. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, pretty much anywhere that you get your podcasts, Spotify, all across the board. If you are on iTunes, if you're on the Apple Podcasts app, please take a few moments to leave a rating and a review. Press subscribe. It really helps me. If you ever want to contact me, you can do so directly. Just send an email to John, John, at fightdeathpodcast.com. Thank you so much for listening.